We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down.
Well, thank you to everybody for coming along this evening. It's a bit of a balmy evening here in Pimlico, and what a better day for this discussion. We're here with Politics and Pubs, and we're going to be discussing digital ID, Panacea or Dystopia. I assume you all have heard what Keir Starmer has said, booze obviously, has announced today in terms of banning under 16s from various social media platforms, although I believe Blue Sky is not one of the ones they're going to be barred from, which is an interesting scenario. And that really opens up something though, doesn't it? It's not just about social media, it's about age verification, because that's what people will need to be able to do to be able to get onto social media accounts, I would assume. Well, I'm delighted that we've got an illustrious panel here with us this evening. To my left is Viggo Terling, the Research Associate at the Adam Smith Institute. And to my right is Darwin Friend, who is a Research Director at the TaxPayers Alliance. Thank you to both of you for coming along. Viggo, do you just want to say a few words about the Adam Smith Institute so people know who you're working for?
Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. Like Dan said, I work at the Adam Smith Institute, and we are a free market think tank that was founded in the late 70s, ahead of the Thatcher revolution, which we were very much a part of. The ASI is a think tank with classically liberal origins. Our namesake is Adam Smith, the Scottish economist, whose magnum opus celebrates its 250th birthday this year, The Wealth of Nations. And we also are staunchly libertarian, and we've criticised strongly on our socials and in our outputs the under 16 social media ban. But we also like free market solutions to the complex issues of today, and I think you'll find some of that in some of my answers on the panel this evening.
Thank you, Viggo. Darwin, what's the Taxpayers Alliance all about?
Thanks very much, Dan, and good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along to join us. So the Taxpayers Alliance, we were set up in 2004 by Matthew Elliott and Andrew Allam in the wake of Gordon Brown, when he was hiking taxes and spending on every taxpayer across the country. And we were set up really with three core principles at heart: that there should be lower, simpler taxes for all taxpayers, that there needs to be more efficient spending by the government so we get the best value for money possible, and that there needs to be greater transparency by the government about how they're using our taxpayers' money. And so it's with that vein that I'm going to be talking about the topic tonight, and actually seeing whether this proposal is going to be something which is going to be beneficial and actually deliver better services for taxpayers, or whether it's just going to be another project that wastes more of taxpayers' money.
Well, quite. If government projects don't usually run to time or to budget, do they? But who knows? So many of us have various forms of ID that we carry around quite often every day. Sometimes it's a passport or a driving licence. Sometimes it's a supermarket loyalty card, something like that. Really, given that we're carrying these forms of ID around at the moment, is digital ID not just the next logical step? Darwin, what do you think?
Well, I agree in one sense where you're coming from. Obviously, I'm sure all of us in some form perhaps have a passport, a driver's license, an online bank account, all of these things where we need to prove our identification. And so, to some extent, you could make the argument that consolidating it all in one place, well, that makes completely logical sense. And I think if we had a government where we actually had some level of trust in them, then maybe it would, because we would know that that information would be used for the purposes that we actually would be giving it over to them in the first place. But I think the problem with the digital ID policy, as we're discussing tonight, is the fact that this government, and no government for many years now, has really had the trust of the people that has elected them into that position, because they've all been elected on a mandate that's going to deliver change and improve all of our lives and make taxes lower and more efficient spending and all of those things. And then what comes to pass is a year, 2 years, in the case of this government, for example, trust is completely broken down. And so while I feel in certain scenarios, perhaps this could be a worthwhile suggestion, because it could improve public services, it could deliver better value for money if we actually thought we would have a government that would deliver those things with it. But unfortunately that's not the case, I feel, right now, and so I don't think this is a proposal that does make much sense.
Viggo, obviously heard from Darwin that we've all probably in the room got a mobile phone, and we allow, to a certain extent, ourselves to be tracked via that means. What do you think about this suggestion?
I think the substance of this question is a really important one, because I think it addresses something really important, which is just how much data on ourselves is out there. I think it's important for people to realise that, some estimates say that company or organisations like Experian, which is a data holding and selling company organisation, some estimates say that they hold up to 96% of profiles, as in data on the profiles of adults in the United Kingdom. So that's about 49 out of 52 million adults in this country. So our data, your personal details, are probably already out there, held by some data and analytics company. But Darwin raised the issue of trust, and I think this is also really important in this debate. Do we trust the government to create and manage a digital ID? Now, I am broadly in favour of what's called e-government. That's the digitalisation of our services. That's allowing technology to come into how we interact with the public sector. And on the issue of trust, I want to start by saying I don't trust the government necessarily to create a digital ID, but I do trust the government with my information. Because I'm Scandinavian originally, and we Scandinavians have this naive optimism about libertarian democracy and liberal democracies, that they fundamentally have our best interests at heart. So, the reason I make that distinction is because I think we need to be more embracing of digitalisation in this country for the sake of innovation, and not halt it by being overly sceptical.
So you mentioned the government side of things. We can, in theory, vote governments out.
Yeah.
But what can we do about private companies? They seem to have a lot of information about us, and maybe they're going to be wanting these digital IDs. Is that a concern for you?
No, not at all. Because the structure of digital ID that we're going for in this country is one built by the governments. And let me again say I'm deeply opposed to such a solution. The type of digital ID I am in favour of is, because everyone, when talking about other digital IDs, we talk about Estonia, we talk about Australia, we talk about India. I think they are all the wrong examples to focus on, and something I've written about a lot and spoken to policymakers about a lot is in Sweden, and I have to declare a conflict of interest here. Like I said, I'm Swedish. We have our own type of digital verification system that is run solely by the banking sector. It was designed, built and funded by the banks at no cost to the taxpayer, and it revolutionised how Swedes interact in their day-to-day public and private lives. And it's immensely productivity boosting. So that's an example of a private sector driven initiative creating a system like the digital ID that the UK government wants to create, but with immense security and immense trust from the people. 95% of Swedish adults trust their information with it. So on the question of am I worried about a private company running a digital ID system? Absolutely not. I would rather trust a private company, because their commercial reputation is at risk if the system they design fails, and that's why it works so well in Sweden.
Well, that's obviously a very interesting example you give there. So just sort of exploring that a bit more, because I'm sure we'd all be very interested to know how this works in Sweden. So the banks,
yeah,
they set it up, presumably so people could transact. I guess that's what the purposes of that. So do they liaise with the government, having set it up themselves? What information does the government get from them?
So it's a bit different in Sweden, and again, this comes into this whole Scandinavians' trust of government. So in Sweden, from the 40s, every Swede is born with a personal identity number. It's sort of like a national insurance number, but much more deeply ingrained. And in the early 2000s, the Swedish government went to the banking sector and basically said, we want you guys to create a digital verification system that would allow people to sign mortgage agreements with the scan of a face on their phone, that would allow people to sign loan agreements, etc., all with a scan of their face. And the reason they went to the banking sector is because I think we can all agree banks are quite renowned, for the most part, in being able to store people's information well. And they went to the banks, and the banks agreed to fund it. They agreed to provide the infrastructure to set it up, and now we've used it in Sweden for 20 years. And like I said, it's revolutionized how we interact on a day-to-day basis. In Norway, which essentially copied Sweden's system, but it's a bit worse because there's a bit more government involvement. When they introduced their bank ID, mortgage approval times went from 16 days and involving 70 pieces of paperwork to 1 day and 0 paperwork. Similarly, 8 out of 10 mortgages were approved versus 5 out of 10 before that, and 7 out of 10 car loans versus 2 out of 10 before the bank ID introduction. So it is a revolutionary infrastructure if done right.
Any concern about that, Darwin?
Well, I agree with Viggo in many senses. Like, if it's done by a company and it's not mandatory, then I don't personally have a problem with it. Because then I will have the choice whether I want to sign up to this digital ID, just as I have a choice whether I want to sign up with this bank or with that bank, for example, or if I want to have a passport or a driver's license. That's ultimately my decision to do that, and part of the terms and conditions of you doing that is that you're going to give away some of your information either to the government or a private company as a result. So if it's not mandatory and it's run by a private company, I don't really have a problem. I think the issue with the debate in the UK that we have is that the government is expressly saying it's going to be running it. And so if it's going to be running it, then it's probably going to be doing it as a mandatory scheme. And the reason it's going to be doing that is because it's going to be introducing that, according to the government's own words, to solve problems which companies can't. Such as, I know they've talked about solving the immigration crisis, potentially, and we need a digital ID as a result by that. It'd be lovely if it were true. I have my doubts, to be honest. But ultimately, if you're going to have something like that, then it's going to have to be mandatory. And so I think that's the big issue between whether we can vote out companies or not compared to the government, is that if it was to be run by a company, ultimately we're deciding to do that in the first place. If it's run by the government, yes, some people might vote for them in order for them to actually introduce that, but there's going to be a majority, seeing as no government normally gets over 50%, who haven't voted for that government, let alone for that policy change. And so I think that's the key issue, is whether it's going to be mandated by the government or whether it's actually going to be a choice made by the individuals who actually want to sign up to it.
So, Viggo, you say in Sweden it's the banks that
Yeah.
did it, but is it now pretty much, is it officially mandatory now?
No, I just want to add something onto what Darwin just said. Because of my experience of how it works in Sweden, I would say that because I don't think we're going to get what Sweden has in this country, because no other country has it. And convincing the government to suddenly drop everything it's already done and spent probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds on developing this infrastructure, telling them, no, this is a bad system, put your trust in British banks. I don't think that would ever happen. So I think we're just going to have to sort of accept that a UK government-run digital ID is the one we're going to get. Now, that said, I would still have that type of system just because of what I've seen, a digital ID be able to do to a society. However, sorry, what was your original question?
So is it, okay, so people could sign up for it through the banks?
Yeah, whether it's mandatory.
But
yeah.
Is it now either officially actually mandatory, or is it one of these things whereby if you haven't signed up to it, you are in reality excluded from quite a lot of society?
Yeah. So it's effective. So the good thing about a bank ID is because it's attached to your bank, you can access it by file or card. So it essentially already solves one of the government's issues that they haven't solved, which is compared to other countries in Europe, the UK isn't actually it's not a leading country when it comes to sort of digital connectivity among all of society. We have a quite large diaspora of people in this country who aren't sort of connected to the internet on a day-to-day basis yet. So there's that issue. How do those people deal with a digital ID that they wouldn't be familiar with? A bank ID solves that because you access it by file or card. But to answer your question, it is implicitly mandatory because, and I had, as a foreign-born Swede, I couldn't really access bank ID until I was 18 years of age, and it was hellish. When you have something that optimizes everything so well, when you're out of that system, having to go through sort of the old ways of doing things is quite burdensome. But it really puts into perspective the immense changes that a digital ID or verification system can bring.
Okay, so that tells me that if it is brought in, and there may be advantages that you've espoused, it strikes me that I would be a bit concerned that it will in effect become mandatory over the course of a few years, officially or unofficially.
Well, the point is you don't have to make it mandatory because people sign up to it for its convenience. So there's no big debate in Sweden like there is here about, what about, the poor people who don't know how to use a phone? Because most, like 99.9% of adults in Sweden aged 18 to 64-ish have a bank ID. Now that should tell you above anything else how good it is, because nearly 100% of the Swedish adult population has signed up to it of their own volition.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump on that. I mean, I guess to play devil's advocate with you, Viggo, I guess the concern with that is almost similar to what's happened in the UK with contactless cards then. Like, effectively, if you want to use cash in pretty much most businesses in this country, you can't do that anymore because they won't take it.
Yeah.
You have to use a contactless. So I guess my concern with that idea, again, if it's coming through a company and effectively it is mandatory rather than being forced upon you, is that if you are going to have this great new system, then obviously in terms of for banks, for example, it makes complete financial sense for them to introduce such a system, because over time it's probably going to mean administration costs are cheaper, they can potentially cut down on staffing and so on like that. So my concern would be as effectively it starts out as non-mandatory, and I know you mentioned about 5% of the population in Sweden doesn't have this.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
So effectively, as Dan was saying, it becomes mandatory over time though, because effectively you're squeezed out of being able to use the former methods that you once had as a result of that, such as I say, in the UK, if I wanted to go and spend £20 down at a local shop or something, or at Pret a Manger or something like that, they don't take cash anymore. So you don't really have any option but to sign up to the rules that they're enforcing on you.
But I would say that's just the natural way of doing things. This might be not analogous at all, but when automobiles were introduced in this country, probably those people who still insisted on using horse carts but couldn't afford an automobile probably got a bit stuffed as well. Naturally we introduce new things that make older ways of doing things obsolete, and that might make some people annoyed. But over time, you just have to accept that we innovate as a society, and some of the things we introduce from a utilitarian perspective will be better for the majority, and we just have to come to terms with that. And that's one of my arguments in this debate. That I think in this country, we are slightly. Skepticism is good. You should be skeptical of all authority and all power and all change, but there's a point at which you're overly skeptical, and then you're actually halting the innovative process.
I mean, I think that they've got reason to be concerned as well, though.
Of course.
I think the big concern for me, obviously, from the TaxPayers Alliance, I care all about how all of our money is being spent by the government, is that we've tried this once before. I remember under Tony Blair, they were trying to introduce ID cards, and then they scrapped that scheme, and we'd already put £4.6 billion into it as a result already. I know I could certainly spend £4.6 billion improving my life, let alone anybody else's. And then this scheme as well. I mean, I think you touched on it, Dan. I mean, when has a government project ever actually run on time and run to cost? So I was looking it up earlier today. The forecast cost for this scheme is going to be about £1.8 billion according to the government. But again, we've seen HS2 costs spiral. We've seen the cost of restoring Parliament costs spiral. And so this will be just the same as that. But ultimately, I agree with Viggo. If it's going to be a company doing it, I don't mind, because the cost is no longer borne by the taxpayer because the government's not doing it. The private company's creating all the infrastructure behind it, and then if there's any subscription cost effectively to sign up to it, I'm not sure what the system is in Sweden regarding that, but then that is ultimately borne by the company rather than all of us, whether we want this ID card or not.
We've talked a little bit about some of the good points of using the Swedish example, and some of the concerns we might have about digital ID, the cost being one of them, certainly if the government organise it. Obviously, there's been an announcement today. This proposal in terms of Keir Starmer and the banning under 16s from social media isn't directly related to digital ID, but it kind of is, because it's going to require, one would assume, some form of age verification. Any concerns about this in terms of, somebody think of the children, as they used to always say on The Simpsons? What do you think about that, Darwin?
Well, firstly, I've got to congratulate you, Dan. You've organised this event, and you clearly have much stronger links to the Starmer government than I realised, because you knew this was coming down the track for all of us to talk about tonight. I mean, as you say, it's very relevant, and I think it's relevant for a key reason, which is I think this youth social media ban, I kind of think is a precursor to a digital ID. I think it's effectively starting that slippery slope towards one, because as soon as we start saying, okay, the government knows what's best for kids to be watching because we've been told by parents that that's what they want to see, and so we're going to implement it, well, what's then going to stop the government from saying, okay, well, we now know what's best in terms of your data, and so we're going to start using that and combining it and consolidating it into a single form of ID because we think that's going to be best to solve the immigration problem or improve public services, which are currently under strain. And so I think that's the key issue when it comes to this. And I think specifically with the announcement they've made today, the concern I would have about that is ultimately what's going to happen to this data in the long run. So they're saying effectively we get the social media company, or not the phone companies, I think it is, are going to know if someone is under 16, for example. Let's assume that they will do that successfully and no 16-year-old knows how to get around the rules, which again I would be hesitant to really agree with. But if we assume that, what happens when that person is over 16 or when they're over 18? Are they holding on to this data? Are they just suddenly going to get rid of it? I mean, what are they doing? If they can impose such a ban such as that, then what else could they potentially be doing? And so I think this is the real problem I have, is how is this data going to be used? And is this ultimately just a long-term path being set by the government towards some form of digital ID, and this is just laying the foundations for it?
Viggo, any concerns about the companies having information on under 16s?
So, if I'm honest, I completely agree with Darwin on most of what he just said. The big issue we have with this digital ID, as I sort of said in my introduction, is I don't think it's an issue of trust. It's just that the government we currently have has nanny statist tendencies, and the under 16 social media ban is a great example, and it is probably a precursor to it might be sort of a precursor to what we might see in terms of how they enforce or what they use the digital ID for to enforce. But again, on the issue of private or public companies or governments having our information, they already do. I mentioned that stat, and there are varying stats, but up to 96% of adult profiles are logged by a company called Experian. So in this country, these companies already have our information, and like I said, I sort of have this naive optimism that we live in a liberal democracy that relies on our trust to get them whose governments rely on our trust to get them re-elected. I don't think they have malicious intents with our data. I suspect many of you might think I have sort of a childlike naivety on that specific question. Yeah, but look, I don't think the issue of information storage from an operational security side, absolutely, because you guys all saw Fable 5, or you may have seen Claude released its latest AI model, Fable 5. That was after 3 days suspended by the US government because they were worried about cybersecurity issues in relation to it. So there are obvious operational security concerns. Can people get this data with malicious intent involved? But in regard to the government's intent, I just don't think it's malicious. And I don't think we have that much to worry about. The benefits outweigh the potential negatives, and I stress potential.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put my 2 pence in. I think your average 14 or 15-year-old will have already worked out a way around this, as in the way that everybody was able to work a way around everything in the past, whether it was having to be 18 to go to the pub, or these little things called VPNs. Now, I've heard the suggestion that you're going to have age verification to be able to get a VPN. That's not going to work. That's not going to work because the internet, kids can get pretty much whatever they want, to be honest. There's always a way around these things. I think Keir Starmer suggested that, well, you're just making it a bit more difficult for them. Well, can't their parents just turn their phones off or something? Apparently all these phones and they have, some sort of system you can turn them off. I don't know. But anyway, okay, so it sounds like some of this might happen. Viggo's quite keen on it. Darwin's a little bit more sceptical. So I'll go to Darwin on this one.
Yeah.
What do you think we could do to push back on this if we didn't want to embrace it?
Well, I think there's three things we can do. The first is, as we do at the Taxpayers Alliance all the time when it comes to tax and spend, is you can resist what the government's doing. You can be constantly making the case that this is wrong and why it is wrong, and making yourselves as loud a voice as possible so that then the government cannot ignore you. We've been doing it for now, 22 years, and I must say, I mean, sometimes it's a bit depressing, yes, to see that the tax burden and spending burden has risen over time, but that doesn't mean you just stop making the case for it. You've constantly got to be fighting the good fight, because if you don't do that, then why should they listen to anyone who's got an opposing opinion to them at all? I think the second thing you can do as part of that as well is support political parties who are opposed to it as well. There's a couple of parties, I'm sure you'll know more than me, Dan, and members in the audience as well, but I know the Lib Dems and the Conservatives have both said that they're against this policy. So you can go out there and support those parties whenever relevant to actually try and garner support around this issue and be clear about why you're voting for them. It might not be that you agree with them on everything, but you agree on principle that this issue is extremely important, and so they're worthy of receiving your vote. And then it kind of, my final thing, links to partly my first one, which is arming yourselves with the facts. Now, there's lots of great organisations, I'm sure, out there talking about digital ID and the costs and the consequences of it. Obviously, we're concerned with the costs more than anything, but you've got organisations such as Big Brother Watch out there who have been leading a good fight on things such as this for many, many years. So I think the best thing you can do first, go out there and arm yourselves with the facts from organisations who are experts in this topic. Second, resist this wherever you possibly can. And third, support political parties who will either reverse this as a policy or make sure it never happens at all.
So Viggo, you're, say, quite keen on this sort of thing, at least in one form or rather than another.
Yeah.
Is there anything you think we can do to limit some of the negatives that might be in place, especially if it is a government-led digital ID?
One of the most welcomed announcements that came in regard to the government system is that they changed their mind from making it mandatory to voluntary. Like I said, I mean, you probably all, like Dan said, I'm hugely pro digital ID, but obviously a voluntary one. We shouldn't compel anyone to do anything. What I would say is, and sort of pushing slightly back on what Darwin said, I think the instinct of many of some of those organisations that Darwin referenced is sort of resist first, think second. I think, you know, there are loads of organisations, Big Brother Watch, etc., that talk, and like Darwin said, that are absolute experts in this field on sort of state encroachment into our private lives. But their rhetoric is often, like I said, resist first, think second. What I think we should all be doing is, instead of sort of lobbying the government to abandon the scheme, I think there's very little discussion about, and it's partly because the government's comms team is so horrendously terrible on this issue, but there's very little discussion about how digital ID could actually change our lives and the positive benefits that may come from it. So I think if we want to try and genuinely influence a better outcome, because I think we all agree that whatever the government designs is probably going to be bad, we should be lobbying groups like the TPA and the ASI and other research organisations to go to government and say, can you see, rather than get rid of this, is there a way to design this better? Because I think that is a more proactive solution to this, rather than saying abandon this scheme that might cost us £1 billion at the end of the day. So that's what I would say. Be proactive in trying to get government and the various organisations involved in its design to push for a better one, not just an outright abandonment of it.
Thank you. Well, a final question. Where do you think we'll be, Viggo, in 5 to 10 years in this, in terms of digital ID? Do you think it'll be a better place, or do you have any concerns?
I'll give my best case and my worst case. So Darwin, and he rightly has mentioned costs. I'm going to push back on that as well. This is a very old study and a singular study, so take this with a pinch of salt. But in 2020, McKinsey estimated that introducing a digital ID in this country would mean 3% of GDP worth in productivity gains, so that's £60 billion. Now, those numbers, all such modelling, you can put a large pinch of salt on it. But the point is irrefutable. That I mentioned Sweden again. 7,000 private sector companies in Sweden use the bank ID verification system just because it does things like reduce mortgage approval rates from 16 to 1 days. The DLVA processes 45,000 letters a day. You could reduce that to nil. So the best case scenario is the government somehow, by a stroke of God, produce a functioning, well-costed digital ID verification system that doesn't encroach on our personal lives too much and instead leads to massive productivity boosts that are great for our economy, as has been seen in Sweden, Estonia, Australia, India, Denmark, Norway, and many other countries with digital verification systems. The bad case, I don't think, is an encroachment on our private lives, but just a system that is expensive, doesn't work, doesn't really benefit our lives that much, and probably gets abandoned by the time reform come into government. That would be a horrible worst case scenario, because digital ID is fundamentally good for us, and I cannot stress that enough. But even a Starmer designed one, I think. So that's my worst case. They design a bad one that just gets thrown out by the next parliament.
What do you think about that, Darwin?
Yeah, I mean, on the upside, I largely agree with Viggo, to be fair, on a lot of these things. In my sunlit uplands, which I like to think of a lot, but which never seem to come about as quick as I'd like them to, I hope that it will improve productivity. I hope that it will support business growth. I hope the government will leave such a scheme, if it were to ever be introduced, to the private sector. And in doing so, as we know quite often, that the private sector is where the innovation happens, where things are most efficient. And so if it leaves it there, I think there is real potential with such a program like a digital ID to actually support people and support businesses at the same time to make their lives better and easier. But my fear, which is normally where things end up rather than where I'd like them to be, is that digital IDs won't have solved the problems that politicians are promising us, which is those sunlit uplands of better public services, the immigration crisis solved, every single problem. It's effectively a silver bullet. Everything's going to be solved if we have this digital ID, and it's the only thing that's holding us back from being able to deliver the change that they promised in 2024. And I fear they will fail in that regard. And if they do, my real fear is even bigger than the one that Viggo espoused, which is that we already in this country have a severe lack of trust between politicians and those of us who elect them into the House of Commons. And I fear that will only worsen once we have yet another scheme which promised us everything and has once again delivered nothing. So if the government is going to go ahead with this, firstly, it should try and do it through the through the private sector, I should say. Or secondly, if they are going to do it through the state sector, they need to focus all their efforts both on costs and delivery timeframes, and also making sure it's only touching people's lives where they're actually going to improve it. But whether we can trust this government, or frankly any government, to do that, I think that is the real question we should all be asking as part of this debate.
Well, time will tell. And it is that time of the evening where we will now be taking a short break to pay the beer tax, as it were, and then we'll come back and everyone will be able to ask our panel questions. But just before we take that break, if you'd all like to join me in thanking our panel in the usual way. Thank you, Darwin, and thank you, Viggo.